Good afternoon, class. My name is Jacob Darbone, and I will be discussing the best practices for hardening operating systems and firewalls. This presentation is for Information Security and Assurance 4220, also known as System Security 2. So for an overview, in this presentation, I will be going over the operating systems present on the two virtual machines we are building, what firewalls are going on those servers, and how to harden both the servers, operating systems, and the respective firewalls. So on Windows, we have a couple of standard methods of hardening the operating system. The first one is ensure you update and change user configurations. What's meant by this is to ensure that when you are creating users that will be using this server, that you limit the access of these users, and included in that, you will also want to limit the access to an administrator account. The reason for doing so is you don't want any user just being able to log in here and start changing settings and system files if they have administrator access. So by limiting the user configurations to only being allowed to access certain areas, you allow your system to be more secure. And if something is to happen and one of your systems fails and a hacker is able to get in, you don't want them being able to get in under the admin account. If they get into another just regular user account, they will be limited in what they can do. So the next thing you'll want to do is to patch and update often. The reason you'll want to do this is you will want to keep your system up to date as often as possible. You want the latest security patches, the latest hot fixes to be on it. This will allow certain aspects of your system to be safer as opposed to not updating. With that being said, if you don't update, as the updates come out that fix issues that were found previously, you're leaving yourself open to those being exploited by outside threats that find those backdoors or loopholes left in your system from not updating. The next issue we will discuss is removing unwanted and unused software. What this entails is going through your system and finding any software that isn't really advantageous in having, or maybe find software that was installed during an update or just during the initial setup that doesn't necessarily have any purpose for you. Deleting these unused and unwanted software also eliminates avenues that attackers can get in through in case one of these softwares has an issue that makes it easy to breach. And deleting that unwanted and unused software is just a really safe way to limit the amount of access that a hacker can have to your system in case that unwanted or unused software is not strong or hardened properly, or wasn't assembled correctly, or has an issue that can be easily exploited. Getting rid of that software is a really easy way to make sure your operating system and server itself are safe. Next will be remote access configuration. For my company, I work for Canon Communications. We have a lot of remote access to servers and client computers. So it is very important that the access that people have when remoting into systems is monitored and configured properly. Again, if you're just needing to go look into a system, you want to make sure that those admin capabilities aren't present on the account you're using to get into it. So you want to just make sure that the configurations for those accounts you're using are created properly and regulated. You don't want somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing having administrator capabilities going in and messing up the system unbeknownst to them just because they simply have no experience in that field, or whatever the case may be, why they're in that server. You don't want them to crash the server because of something they do that they didn't know would cause that issue. So taking care of who has access to remoting in to your server is also a very important aspect of hardening. The next aspect we will discuss is policies and group policies. These pretty much are established to inform users what they can and can't do on the server, whether physically there or remoting into it. It's important to keep these policies updated and have them easily distributable to the other employees that have access to these systems, so that both you and the other users know what is acceptable and isn't acceptable when remoting into software or using the server for whatever purpose you have to be on it. So these policies are very important to have established and updated regularly and distributed so that everyone knows what's going on in that department. And lastly, for hardening, you want to back up often and restore the images you create on your server, so that way if an error occurs or you get a virus or ransomware or you have a power outage and you lose data that was needed, you have these backups that you can restore to that will get you back to running either at capacity again or getting you to a point where you can get ready to get back to full capacity rather than having a full shutdown of that server. Processes you can do this with are Image Manager and Shadow Protect, just to name two softwares that you can use for backup, which are very important to have. Image Manager would manage those images, consolidate them, and replicate them to the cloud so that you have those backups not only on site but on the cloud in case something happens to your database in particular. And then Shadow Protect will keep these safe and make sure that they're ran properly. So those are two softwares you could run concurrently that will allow your backups to be more secure also, which would be very important for hardening your server. So next up, we'll talk about Ubuntu and the best practices to harden this system. Again, making sure your system is up to date is very important. Running these security updates and system updates to ensure that your system is not running behind updates. It's not running at a more vulnerable state. These updates that come out are hot fixes for security issues and things of that nature. So making sure your system is up to date is incredibly important. Stack protection. You can run the stack protection, and what it does is it creates a canary value that allows software that runs stacks to not be overflowed or not have a buffer overflow, and it's just a way to keep certain services and softwares safe as well when you're using Ubuntu. Password hashing is very important to create secure passwords through SSH, and what this does is allows for your passwords to be more secure and make it harder for threats and attackers to get into your system. Partitioning disks to set up certain disks to do certain things rather than having one disk that houses everything from all the software, all the configurations, things of that nature. Partitioning allows a more secure setup to have separate softwares and separate services running in different partitions, which makes it harder to navigate through for hackers that get in, and it makes it more safe for you. Again, like Windows, user configurations is very important to ensure that users don't have access to the root account or root users, so that you can't go in and just make changes willy-nilly without having the proper access to that account. So user configurations is very important as well. And avoid using the root access account as often as possible. You don't want to use a root user too much. You'd rather create different configurations, so in case you're in the system and you do get attacked, that account that gets taken will not have admin capability, so you won't be able to get into the system as hard or be able to do as much. So avoiding multiple root user accounts access and then the user configurations are both very important to Ubuntu server hardening. Next, we will talk about Windows Firewall best practices. The first one we'll discuss is running Windows Security Configuration Wizard. And what this is a wizard setup guide on Server Manager that takes into account what policies you're running and what server profile you have. and will automatically update and set up the security configuration that will best suit your server at the time. They don't recommend, they being the Microsoft team running documents about the servers, and a couple of other websites I had found, don't recommend manual updating because you run the risk of missing something or overlooking an issue that you could have fixed previously if the wizard had run. So they recommend just running the wizard. The next thing we'll discuss is stopping unnecessary services and features that aren't being used. And this goes back to the very similar idea on the Windows operating system. And these unnecessary services and features that are not being used are just accidents waiting to happen, with one of these services maybe crashing, or one of these services running causes issues with another service you actually need. So just making sure you stop unnecessary services and features that aren't being used is very important. Updating and applying necessary policies is also an incredibly important aspect to firewalls, to inform your firewall what is and isn't allowed through the network, telling it what ports it needs to be running through and what ports should be blocked and everything. So updating and applying these policies is very important. Also, with that, you want to make sure you remove or change policies that may conflict with more important policies. When you have these firewalls, you could have upwards of 400, 500 to 1,000 different policies, depending on how complicated your server and network system is. And keeping these policies or not updating those policies that could conflict with another policy creates quite a few issues and can potentially be catastrophic, and causing the firewall to not work properly, which would just allow any threat out there to get into it and ruin your system. So updating and applying necessary policies, as well as getting rid of old policies or outdated policies, is very important. And you also want to update and patch the firewall often, similar to patching and updating the operating system and the server itself. Making sure that your firewall is running well like it needs to and is updated with the security fixes and hot fixes that it needs to run effectively and efficiently are important. So updating your firewall is a critically important aspect. And backing up an image is important because you want to make sure that you have images to fall back on just in case something occurs, or you have a power outage, or again, anything of that nature that will cause you to lose data, and lose that software or whatever you're in the middle of doing, and having that image to go back to and restore from is definitely very important. And watch and manage proper port access. You'll just want to make sure that your mail ports are being used properly, and that all the proper ports that are supposed to be used and that are recommended to be used are being used, instead of trying, a custom port that you maybe saw online could work for that service. You want to make sure that you're using the proper one, and you don't want to go outside of those boundaries and risk testing anything that could cause failure. So next we'll talk about SE Linux and IP tables firewall. And what SE Linux is a security enhanced Linux, and it is an aspect that can be installed on most Ubuntu servers. And what it does is creates a more compatible and friendly interface to use to set up for security properties, and it allows a more secure Linux to be run, and it's just a much simpler interface to do that with. And with that, you run concurrently IP tables, which is the firewall that can be used, which you can also use UFW, which in our circumstance we're using IP tables, so that's what we'll focus on. And in order to do what you can to harden this system, you'll want to update your policies often. And with that, again, as we've discussed multiple times in the PowerPoint presentation beforehand, creating these policies and making sure all of them are up to date and that you're not running policies that will conflict with each other will help you effectively harden your system and run it more safely and securely. It'll also help it make it run more effectively and efficiently, because these policies will guide the system in what it needs to do and not do, which will allow it to run properly. You'll want to patch regularly to ensure that your system is up to date and not falling behind or missing key components that have been updated in a hotfix or something of that nature. Enabling IP tables and running that with SE Linux will also make your system far more secure, because you are running the security interface and the firewall. And again, you'll want to restrict ports that don't need to be used, and you'll want to monitor those ports to make sure a policy you install won't have one of those ports being used when it's not supposed to. And you just want to limit access to running services. Again, you don't need a bunch of services running concurrently that could be causing issues with each other. SE Linux and IP tables sometimes have issues, but there are reach arounds out there and backdoors that will help you get those systems working properly together so they don't cause issues with each other. And these are the things you can do to harden the Ubuntu servers and firewalls. And that's it for the PowerPoint presentation. The last page is my works cited. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and good luck to everyone. I hope to hear from you all soon.